Hi everyone, and welcome back to our video on the Language Technique Glossary. Now this is part 2 of our 3-part Language Technique Glossary, and in this video we'll just simply be continuing through the techniques which you can use and looking at examples of those techniques in a bit more detail. So continuing on from the techniques that we've already looked at, let's start by looking at the idiom. Now the idiom creates a colloquial and informal technique in a way to characterize. So sort of very much like a colloquial language, it's more just a specific facet of that overall genre of technique. It's a commonly used expression whose meaning isn't clear from the words used. So it's something which is a bit metaphorical or a bit unclear to someone who wouldn't usually be using that sort of expression. This is particularly strong in Australian usage, and we get that Australian slang, which to the outsider doesn't really make any sense because it doesn't really seem to express what the author is actually trying to say. So if we look at an example of idiom, dying means kicking the bucket. So kicking the bucket is just a sort of metaphorical, colloquial way of saying that someone died. We just get that sense that ideas are translated into almost a different dialect. Frustration could be translated to banging your head against a brick wall. Or saving money could be making ends meet. Techniques like that which are metaphorical, which are colloquial, and which really show a casual tone for the reader. Let's have a look at imagery as a technique. Now, imagery is a blanket term for all visual techniques. It's not a specific technique, it's more of just a heading that covers a number of the techniques we've already looked at. So it's anything which makes a picture in your mind, for example, creating a setting or describing a character. Basically what imagery is that once you've read it, you think, yeah, I can imagine that in my mind, I can see and I can hear what that person's describing to me. It's also best to be specific about techniques, for example, not resting on imagery. If we take a look at an example of this, we'll see in Robert Frost's poem, Once by the Pacific, the clouds were low and hairy, like locks blown forward in the gleam of eyes. So we get that sense there of the way that he's really constructing a mental picture for the reader. And that's an example of the way that language can be used to really paint that scenario in your mind when you read it. The technique of jargon is also a really important one. Jargon is particular words that are used and understood only by people who are experts or specifically involved in different groups. So it's quite exclusive language. It's language that only a certain group will understand. It's often formal and impressive language, which shows a sense of status. If we take a look at some examples of jargon, a rugby league enthusiast might use terms like play the ball, sin bin, or overlap. Now these are words that, a person who wasn't particularly interested in rugby league wouldn't understand. However, someone who's a rugby league enthusiast can really associate with. Sidestep. These are all examples of this type of technique. So let's take a look at the technique of metaphor. Now, metaphor is a direct relationship where one thing or idea substitutes another. So it's not a sense that something is like something or as something, it's that something is something else. It's a direct substitution. So it really shows a strong relationship between the properties of the two items. It's not a loose comparison, but a very definite, very strong one. It also has often a very symbolic meaning. As we've discussed, a language technique can provide that second level of analysis, and a metaphor is really a key example of that. So if we look at an example of metaphor, the goalkeeper was a strong rock. We get the sense that the goalkeeper is this strong rock fortress, protecting the goal against the enemy. The curtain of night fell down onto the village. So night is literally a physical curtain falling down. The technique of motif is also a really important one, and one which is particularly common in text, one that you'll really need to be able to identify. So a motif is a recurring important idea or image mentioned at key points in a text. So it seems to go on and on and on in the text. It seems to be always coming up, always there. So this can be often more than one motif to create that extra level of complexity. This differs from a theme in that a motif can actually be expressed by a single word, not an idea or a sentence. So it's something which really can be expressed through a physical object and on a more metaphorical level, suggesting a deeper meaning. So if we take a look at an example of a motif, in this sort of 3 extracts from a story, the little girl clutched the flower, excited to bring it home to her mother. As they read her bedtime story, the flower sat in a vase beside them. Now she gazes at the flower, missing her. So flower at 3 different points in the story is really a way of exploring the sense that that relationship between the mother and daughter did exist and was very strong, but then something happened. So it's really a way of exploring that changing relationship. So something simple as a flower can have a lot wider meaning. Onomatopoeia is a technique which can also be used. Now this is when words describing sounds actually sound like the sounds they describe. So this is a bit of a funny technique. It's a bit more of a casual one and a bit humorous. So this is particularly effective in audio text such as plays and films. This refers to any utterance as well, which is a motive. So things like ah and roar, which express that sort of sense that this could be a sound that was quite a strong sound. This could be, an animal making a sound. This could be a sound effect, things like that. So all you could hear was the buzzing of the fly until squish, Dad stomped it under his boot. So those 3 words there, you get the buzzing of the fly, the Z sound, to show that sound that the flies make when they buzz. Squish, with the SH showing the sound that it makes as it squashes under his foot. And stomp is that very harsh sound, expressing that same action, as stomping your foot down. So 3 examples of onomatopoeia there that really show you that idea. An oxymoron is another technique which is really important. So it's a contradiction in terms. It's used deliberately to create an extreme image. So 2 things that don't really make sense together, but the author's doing deliberately. It's also for humorous purposes. For example, a character might actually use 2 contradictory words in their statement to show their ignorance. So an oxymoron is a really important technique with a lot of different ways to apply. So words like accidentally on purpose, that's an example of an oxymoron. It's accidentally but also on purpose. How is that possible? Express queue. It's supposedly moving fast but you're still in a queue. The love-hate relationship, that's sort of 2 different elements, love and hate, the opposite emotions. Non-alcoholic wine, so wine that's got no alcohol content even though wine's an alcohol. Paradox is another technique which is really important and one which is perhaps a little bit more abstract than others, so one that you'll really need to think about a bit more. So a paradox is a situation which cannot possibly exist because different elements of it cancel each other out. You look at it and you think, that seems impossible, that just doesn't seem right. However, the fact is that the author's done that to prove a point. This can be used to make things seem impossible. So if we take a look at George Orwell's book 1984, we see examples of the way that paradox are used. So war is peace, so that 2 contrasting ideas. Freedom is slavery, again 2 opposing ideas in one sentence, supposedly one being another. And also ignorance is strength. So again we get that sense that, these things shouldn't be right, and yet they are. That's the technique of a paradox. So this brings us to the end of part 2 of our 3-part Glossary of Language Techniques series. Join us in just a moment in part 3 and we'll finish our analysis of the sort of language techniques and examples of those techniques which you can apply in your analytical essay.